coming to lectures as amazing as this one.
Oh, well.
The pandemic, otherwise we may not have had access to you.
Yeah, it's great that everyone is learning how to communicate more over Zoom. I see many more people.
As amazing as this one. The pandemic, otherwise we may not have had access.
Okay, we begin. Let people join in. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone. And I am Dr. Imtiaz Yusuf here at Istac, and I welcome you to this webinar, which is the part of the Islamization of Knowledge and Futures of Knowledge program. And we have a very interesting topic today, which is the biological and psychological foundations of Islamic law. Before I go into, or we start our meeting today, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Is Dr. Aria Nakissa. He is Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. He has a very interesting biographical background. He is born in the United States of an Iranian father and an American mother. And at the age of 15, when he was studying he was searching for the meaning, I believe, and he studied all the world religions. And he accepted Islam as his religion. He converted to Islam. And he has been a Sunni, practicing Sunni Muslim since the age of 15 onwards, alhamdulillah, until today. So let me say something more about our speaker, Dr. Aria Nakissa. How did I find him? As many people ask me, who invited him and do you know him? Of recent, since I work in comparative religion, since last 30 years, the theories of Freud, Carl Jung, and Erikson have become kind of outdated. And in last 30 years, there has emerged a new approach or theory, which is called cognitive science of religion, or cognitive science, which is both connected. And the most important book was written on cognitive science of religion, related with it, by Pascal Boyer, who is an evolutionary anthropologist. And he wrote a book titled Religion Explained, and which basically says religion is neural, to put it very briefly. Or he is using the same thing, that religion is neurosis, but he says religion is neural. Man creates God, and that's how religions originate, through religious feeling. So religion is neural. At the same time, Boyer talks about human consciousness as being naturalistic. Now, since I was teaching comparative religion before I joined Istac 2.5 years ago, I had this challenge of teaching cognitive science of religion. And I was searching and looking on the internet, has any Muslim contributed to the cognitive science of religion? And that's why I found out there's a young scholar called Aria Nakissa who has written on cognitive science of religion from the perspective of Islam. He has very interesting 2 articles, although he's not going to talk about cognitive science of religion tonight. He has 2 interesting articles. One is titled Cognitive Science of Religion and the Study of Islam, Rethinking Islamic Theology, Law, Education, and Mysticism, using the works of Al-Ghazali, which was published in a very interesting journal, a very critical journal called Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. Normally, they don't tolerate pro-religious people, but alhamdulillah, he got published in that, and it goes to his credit that his work is recognized. In that article, he talks about there are very few people, Muslims in Islamic studies, who are interested in cognitive science of religion. And then he has another article on cognitive and quantitative approaches to Islamic studies, integrating psychological, socioeconomic, and digital cultural statistics, which is published again in another very important journal called Religion Compass. So I immediately contacted Aria. I said I wanted to know his work, and he sent me his papers, and I learned a lot from him. So Alhamdulillah, I was so happy to meet with this young man who is doing cognitive science of religion, and one of the rare persons doing that. Besides that, so let me introduce him formally. He is, as I said, a professor of Islamic studies and anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He holds a joint PhD in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University. And he also has a degree called JD, which is Juris Doctor, which, according to the American system, allows him to practice law from Harvard Law School. And you'll be surprised to know that he did his MA in Islamic law from International Islamic University, Malaysia. So he is not a stranger to us. Professor Bargud asked me, and he told me, yes, he's not a stranger to us. So that is his background. And today, or tonight, your day and my night, he's going to be talking about the biological and psychological foundations of Islamic law. He has published a book titled The Anthropology of Islamic Law, Education and Ethics, Legal Interpretation of Egypt's Al-Azhar from Oxford University in 2019. And he has published in reputed journals from around the world. So I welcome Dr. Aria. Please make your presentation. Welcome.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I'd like to say, assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone. And I want to begin by thanking Istac generally and Dr. Imtiaz Yusuf in particular for the opportunity to address all of you today. If it weren't for Professor Imtiaz's efforts, this wouldn't have been possible. And it's truly an honor to be here. So, as indicated by the title of the talk, today I'm going to be speaking about the biological and psychological foundations of Islamic law. And much relevant research on this topic is indeed associated with cognitive science. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the human mind. It draws on a range of fields, including biology, psychology, neuroscience, economics, cultural anthropology, archaeology, and history. Cognitive science posits that the mind contains a set of evolved biological mechanisms, and these mechanisms are believed to shape thought, emotion, and behavior in such a way that gives rise to some general biologically rooted patterns which recur across different societies. And some of these patterns are of special interest to scholars, or should be of special interest to scholars of Islamic studies, because these patterns are related to religion in many cases, and they're related to morality in many cases. So cognitive science research identifies these biologically rooted patterns using a variety of research methods, including experiments with young children, cross-cultural surveys, brain scans, and even studies of animal behavior. For instance, suppose we make a claim that human beings naturally endorse certain moral principles. For example, it is often claimed that humans naturally believe that they have a moral obligation to care for their family members, to help their family members out, give them food, defend them, provide them with shelter. How could you prove a claim that human beings naturally believe that they have a moral obligation to help their family members? Well, there are a number of ways that people have attempted to do this. So one thing that you can do is you can use psychological experiments with young children. And such experiments demonstrate that when children reach a particular age, they automatically start helping their family members. You can also do cross-cultural surveys. You can examine all the cultures across the world, all the cultures throughout human history. And what you'll see is that in every culture that we have anthropological evidence about, they have this norm that people should help their family members. You can even look at the behavior of animals. So you can look at human-like primates such as chimpanzees and bonobos. And when you study creatures of this type, you can observe the fact that they do in fact help family members. So for instance, they share food with them, groom them, protect them if they are threatened. I'll give you another example of a moral principle. So it's often claimed that human beings not only have a moral intuition that they should care for kin, they also have a moral intuition that property rights exist, with the consequence that it is immoral for one person to steal the property of another. What sorts of evidence could you adduce for such a claim? Well, once again, we can consider psychological experiments as one source of evidence. Evidence of this type demonstrate that young children automatically condemn stealing when they see it. So for instance, when a person takes the toy of a child away from a child, the other children will condemn that action. We also see that in cross-cultural, when we use cross-cultural surveys, we see that every human society has some notion of property rights, and they also endorse some prohibition on stealing. Even animals appear to have certain basic conceptions of property. So for instance, animals will stake out territories and they will defend their particular territories. And indeed, you even get more complex behavior among chimpanzees. So for instance, if one chimpanzee is holding a piece of fruit, other chimpanzees will show respect for this ownership. They won't try and take that fruit out of the chimpanzee's hands, even if they're able to do it because they're stronger. So it appears that even among animals, there are certain rudimentary elements of what within human beings is associated with notions of respect for other people's property. So in sum, using empirical research, it is possible in principle to establish that humans have certain biologically rooted intuitions about morality. And in fact, cognitive science research indicates that humans possess a highly complex and multifaceted morality. And this morality might be described, one particular description of this complex human morality would be as follows. Human morality consists of three basic biologically rooted patterns of thought. And these three biologically rooted patterns of moral thinking that we find in all human beings can be called utilitarian thinking, deontological thinking, and group conventional thinking. Because these three types of moral thinking characterize human beings, they characterize every moral system which has ever been used by human beings, produced by human beings. So that would include all the different cultural systems of morality. It would also include all of the religious systems of morality. And we can see, or I will argue, that in fact, we can find these three types of thinking, utilitarian thinking, deontological thinking, and group conventional thinking in the Islamic legal tradition. So let me explain. I want to begin by looking at utilitarian thinking. According to utilitarian thinking is a certain way of thinking about morality, about what's morally good, what's morally bad. So according to utilitarian thinking, actions and rules are morally good if based on their consequences. If they have the consequences of increasing human happiness and decreasing human suffering, they're good. Meanwhile, actions or rules which decrease human happiness or increase human suffering are bad, are morally bad. For example, there are certain rules that prohibit murder. There are certain rules that prohibit theft. These are considered morally good because they increase happiness and they decrease suffering. So if you have a rule that bans theft or a rule that bans assault, you're decreasing suffering because you're protecting people from the pain that comes with being assaulted or stolen from. So in sum, utilitarian thinking centers on judging actions morally good or bad by considering the consequences, by considering their consequences on happiness. Basic elements of utilitarian thinking can actually be found in a variety of non-human species like cuttlefish, rats, chimpanzees. So for instance, many non-human species consider the consequences of their actions, and they do this in quantitative terms related to their happiness. So to give a very simple example, If you give a chimpanzee the choice between 6 chocolate chips and 7 chocolate chips, it will choose 7 chocolate chips. In other words, the chimpanzee will take the action, which has the consequence of maximizing its happiness, giving it the most chocolate chips, because those chocolate chips make that chimpanzee happy. Nevertheless, even though utilitarian thinking can be found in a variety of different animal species, in humans it takes a very, very specific form. So from childhood, children instinctively form cooperative groups, and they seek to cooperate to perform actions which will have the consequence of increasing their group's happiness. And such actions are obviously good from a utilitarian standpoint. So for instance, you might have 7 hungry individuals, maybe 7 hungry children. They will form a group, choose a tree that has a lot of apples, and then work together to get the apples from the tree, and then divide up the apples in a roughly equal manner, such that all of them receive a share of these apples, and this boosts the happiness of everyone in the group. So we can see that human beings are inclined to make choices in terms of what to do in a way that is calculated to have consequences which increase the happiness of their group. More generally, experiments have demonstrated that all human beings employ utilitarian thinking when making moral decisions, at least to some extent. And indeed, in experiments of this type, it has been discovered that utilitarian thinking is actually associated with particular patterns of brain activity that can be monitored through neuroimaging. Okay. Like other moral systems, Islamic law incorporates utilitarian thinking. In discussing utilitarian thinking, pre-modern Muslim scholars frequently use the Arabic term maslaha. So a maslaha is a good. It is something which brings happiness or ladha, and it eliminates or reduces pain, which is, madarra or alam. Pre-modern Muslim scholars frequently assert that God has laid down the rules of the Sharia in order to secure goods for humankind, jalb al-maslaha, thereby increasing their happiness and decreasing their suffering. This line of thinking receives its most elaborate expression in the theory of maqasid al-Sharia, a theory which is developed by a number of prominent medieval scholars, including al-Juwayni, al-Ghazali, Ibn Abd al-Salam, al-Qarafi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, and al-Shatibi. For instance, we can apply maqasid al-Sharia, or these scholars apply maqasid al-Sharia to understand texts like the Quran. So in the Quran, God lays down a rule which prescribes amputation of the hand as a penalty for theft. In the view of Muslim scholars, God laid down this rule to protect property rights, hifth al-mal, and protecting property rights is good because it eliminates the pain of being victimized by theft. Various methods of Islamic legal interpretation presume that God's rules seek to secure goods which increase human happiness. 2 obvious examples are istihsan and istislah. So istihsan involves making an exception to a general Sharia rule for the sake of securing a good that increases happiness. Meanwhile, istislah posits that a general rule is no longer valid, for it no longer operates to secure a good which increases happiness. A less obvious example would be qiyas. So even when we're dealing with qiyas, we still have to identify the illah, and that involves considerations of maslaha, which is of course tied to the doctrine of munasabah. However, although utilitarian thinking is one important biologically rooted pattern of human moral thought, it's not the only one. Recall that there are 2 others. So deontological thinking and group conventional thinking. So let's now turn to the second of the 3 moral thinking patterns, namely deontological thinking. Deontological thinking presumes that humans have a set of basic intuitions about which actions are good or bad. And these actions are deemed to be good or bad in all circumstances, regardless of the consequences. For instance, lying is always morally bad, even if a lie has the consequence of making the person who hears it happier. So even if it has the consequence of boosting happiness. Similarly, sibling, at least according to deontological reasoning, deontological thinking. Sibling incest can likewise be conceptualized as something which is morally bad. And that's even if there are two siblings and having incestuous relations makes them happy. And maybe if there's even no danger of genetically damaged offspring because they use contraceptives, this act of incest can still be seen as bad in all circumstances, regardless of the consequences, regardless of how happy it makes people who participate in it. Notice that deontological thinking differs in certain fundamental ways from utilitarian thinking. So in utilitarian thinking, judging an act morally good or bad depends on its consequences for human happiness. By contrast, in deontological thinking, certain acts are deemed morally good or bad regardless of their consequences for human happiness. Cognitive science research indicates that in keeping with deontological thinking, humans naturally view particular acts as morally good or morally bad, regardless of the consequences. And I will give four brief examples to illustrate this, although one could give many more. So first, research indicates that humans naturally believe that dishonesty is morally bad, such that one should not lie or violate his or her oaths and promises. And this is a moral intuition that we find reflected in Islamic law. So Islamic law forbids lying, and it also forbids the breaking of oaths. So for instance, there are specific penalties laid down. Oh, if you break an oath, you have to maybe feed or clothe 10 people, for example. A second moral intuition. So humans naturally believe, this was one that I mentioned earlier, humans naturally believe that they are morally obligated to care for family members, with more closely related family members deserving more care. And this intuition underlies a great many Islamic legal rules. So according to these rules, parents must care for their young children. According to these rules, children must care for their aged parents, and this involves the provision of food, of protection, of shelter, and the people who you owe the most duties to are those who are most closely related to you. So maybe you owe some type of obligation to your entire set of family members, but you owe more to, let's say, your direct family members, your parents or your children or your grandchildren, rather than, let's say, your aunts, or rather than your cousins, and to your first cousins more than your second cousins. Moreover, in Islamic law, these obligations to take care of your family are not restricted to this life. They even extend after death. And this is reflected in Islamic inheritance rules. So according to Islamic inheritance rules, you can't give your wealth after death to whomever you please. Rather, you have to use it to help your kin and there are specific inheritance rules that say, for instance, my father and my mother or my children get these particular shares, and those shares are their right. Let's move on to a third example of a moral intuition tied to deontological thinking. So this is a very interesting one. It concerns disgust. So there's a lot of research which indicates that humans have evolved to react with emotional feelings of disgust upon encountering certain types of substances and behaviors, especially those which are likely to cause disease. So what are some substances that trigger disgust reactions? These substances are often bodily secretions like vomit, pus, blood, semen, feces, urine. Also, particular sexual behaviors automatically trigger these disgust reactions, in particular incest, promiscuity, bestiality. These substances and behaviors are regarded as disgusting. And in that sense, they should be contrasted with another set of behaviors, which are not disgusting. So behaviors which are not considered disgusting are deemed to be pure. So humans naturally believe that they have a moral obligation to maintain purity and avoid that which is disgusting. And this is also reflected in Islamic law. So Islamic legal rules condemn things which are disgusting, which are qadar, najis, qabih, and they demand that Muslims keep their bodies, their behaviors, and their physical spaces pure or tahir. For instance, Islamic legal rules require that Muslims remove bodily secretions by washing themselves before the 5 daily prayers in wudu, or after going to the bathroom, istinja, or after they have to wash themselves with ghusl after sex, menstruation, or childbirth. And purity rules also are a major dimension of various Islamic legal rules regarding sex. So you have all kinds of regulations on sexual behavior. So there are bans on incest, bans on promiscuity, bans on bestiality. These are seen as impure sexual acts. Let me move to my fourth and final example of a moral intuition that is tied to deontological thinking. This concerns reciprocity. And reciprocity is a moral intuition that's tied to particular emotions, in particular, specifically love and gratitude. So humans naturally believe that there is a moral obligation to repay benefits and to express gratitude for the benefits that you have received. So for instance, if an individual gives me a benefit, I'm obliged to say thank you, and I should be ready to repay that benefit. For example, if a person gives me food when I'm hungry, I should say thank you, and I should be willing to give that person food if he or she is hungry. The notion of repaying benefits and expressing gratitude is addressed in Islamic legal discourse under the heading of shukr al-mun'am. And this notion of shukr al-mun'am is important for understanding Islamic worship. Plus, the basic premise in Islamic theology is that God gives human beings many benefits. All of their health is from God. All of their food is from God. The fact that they have a shelter, the fact they have a place to live, that is from God. And as a result, because human beings have received all of these benefits, all of these ni'am from Allah, they are morally obligated to thank Him. They are also morally obligated to strive to repay His many favors upon human beings. So for instance, if God says to us, if God gives a commandment, if He asks for human help in achieving particular objectives. So if God says, you should help me by taking care of the poor, by paying alms or zakat, humans must do so. If God asks human beings to help by protecting the weak, by punishing murders with qisas, they have a moral obligation to do so. More generally, when He asks human beings to help Him create a just society, by implementing the Sharia, humans must do so. And by helping God in this way, humans work to repay the many favors that He has given to them, has conferred upon humankind. To sum up, many Islamic legal rules are not only based on utilitarian thinking, they're also based on some measure of deontological thinking, on the belief that there are certain actions which are morally good or morally bad, regardless of the consequences. And this deontological dimension of Islamic law is most fully discussed by particular Islamic theological schools. The Mu'tazilites are one, and also certain Hanafis and Maturidites will often discuss this notion as well. So they will assert that through aql, through reason, it is possible to see that certain acts are morally good or morally bad. So for instance, reason can see that lying is morally bad. Reason can see that there is a moral obligation to reciprocate benefits that are given to you, like shukr al-mun'am. Okay. So now we've dealt with utilitarian thinking, we've dealt with deontological thinking. Now I want to move on to the third biologically rooted pattern of moral thinking, namely group conventional thinking. And the basic idea is this: it's a little complex, so I'll introduce it right now and then I'll gradually explain it. But the basic idea with group conventional thinking is as follows. Humans have a biologically rooted intuition that it is good to preserve their group and its way of life, as reflected in its distinctive rules and norms. So experiments demonstrate that humans naturally and unconsciously divide the world into different communities. And each of these communities is defined by particular shared characteristics. Those characteristics might be shared blood, shared cultural practices, shared religious practices, often all of the above. And humans naturally believe that it's morally good to protect your community. And as part of that, they believe that it is morally good to preserve one's community's distinctive way of life. And these natural impulses underlie phenomena such as tribalism, patriotism, nationalism, as well as moral opposition to the biological or cultural genocide of one's people. So people say, I don't want to see my people destroyed in an act of cultural genocide. That's something wrong. That's something that I want to work against. So group conventional thinking is the belief that it's morally good to preserve one's community and its distinctive way of life. And in fact, psychological experiments indicate that from childhood, humans engage in group conventional moral thinking. Thus, these experiments indicate that from age 3, children instinctively assume that group norms exist and should be followed, even if they are to some extent non-rational or arbitrary, and even if they're not explicitly stated. And the way that children deduce these rules is based on the actions that they see from others in their group. So for example, it is possible to show 3-year-olds the following type of scenario. An adult takes a pen, taps it 2 times on the table, and then uses this pen to push a wooden block off the table. When 3-year-olds see this type of action, they automatically infer that there is a group rule which should be followed. In other words, when you're interacting with this piece of wood, you shouldn't just touch it with your hands. You should push it with a pen, and you should tap the pen 2 times before then. And in fact, when they see people interact, if the children see people interact with the wooden block by touching it with their hands rather than pushing it with a pen, or by pushing it with a pen before tapping the pen 2 times, they criticize them. They say, that's not how it's done. That's not the rule. So these children, and in fact, children automatically get angry about this. So they automatically, when they see that there's a rule which guides their group behavior, they believe that it should be followed. They develop a desire to follow it themselves, and they condemn people from their group that violate the rule. Another thing that you find from these psychological experiments is that children, in fact, distinguish between different types of norms and different types of morality. So children believe that certain norms, if you ask them, especially when you're talking about, let's say, deontological, norms related to deontological thinking. If you ask children, should any human be allowed to lie? They say no. Should any human be allowed to steal or assault another person? They say no. However, children will say that there are certain norms that only bind a group. So these will tend to be the conventional norms. So for instance, like tapping a pen before using it to push a piece of wood. So children believe that there's a type of norm which has a non-rational element that only binds members of a specific group. So for instance, Chinese people are obliged to follow Chinese cultural norms, but if you're not Chinese, you're not obliged to follow those norms, even though there are other norms like not stealing, not killing, not lying, that all people are obliged to follow. Group conventional thinking centers on the distinctive norms characteristic of specific groups. And Islamic law, I would argue, recognizes that many of its norms are distinctive in the sense that they have a special binding quality upon that community that follows the Prophet Muhammad, namely the community of Muslims. So examples are the rules requiring 5 daily prayers to Mecca, or 5 daily prayers towards Mecca, or fasting the month of Ramadan. Muslim scholars acknowledge that earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus and their communities were righteous, but they didn't practice these particular rules of fasting, of these particular rules of prayer. And that's because there are certain rules which are characteristic of each religious group. They have a special binding property on that religious group. The notion that different religious groups are bound by different rules also underlies the Islamic legal conceptions of millah. So a millah is a religious community bound by a distinctive sharia, a distinctive set of rules. And Muslims take it for granted that there are these different religious communities that are going to exist, and they're all going to wish to preserve their distinctive rules. And the Islamic State, the Islamic government, typically grants them the right to do so on the condition that they pay tribute or jizya and acknowledge Muslim political authority. And it's not only that Muslims grant these other communities the ability to preserve their distinctive form of life. Muslims are also obliged, according to the Sharia, to preserve their distinctive way of life by adhering to the Sharia and criticizing people who don't adhere to the Sharia through the principle of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. In Islamic legal discourse, reference to group conventions that are specific to Muslims, these conventions are off, these group norms, these distinctive group norms are often discussed with reference to the term ta'abbud or ta'abbudi. So something which is ta'abbudi, is described from the word, ta'abbudi is derived from the word ta'abbud, which denotes unquestioning submission to God. So when Muslim scholars describe a religious rule as ta'abbudi, they indicate that certain aspects of this rule should be submitted to, even though they appear non-rational. For instance, it's not obvious why Muslims should pray 5 times a day as opposed to 6 times a day. Likewise, it's not obvious why slander or qadhf is punished with 80 lashes as opposed to 70 lashes. But according to Islamic law, rules of this type simply have to be submitted to. And it's possible to imagine that other groups, even other righteous groups like the followers of prophets before the time of Muhammad, prayed differently. The idea is that Muslims have a distinctive group norm such that their prayer is 5 times a day. Whereas while other communities may punish slander differently, it is the Muslim norm to punish it with 80 lashes. That is part of the distinctive Muslim form of life that is embodied in the Sharia. Group conventional thinking receives a special attention, I would argue, in Asharite theological discourse. Thus, Asharites stress the idea that Islamic legal rules are conventions which God has laid down for the Muslim community. And these conventions are binding upon Muslims, even if Muslims are limited in their capacity to explain them rationally. To sum up, I have noted that there are 3 basic biologically rooted patterns of moral thinking, namely utilitarian thinking, deontological thinking, and group conventional thinking. These 3 patterns are found in all moral systems, including Islamic law, and all are important. Utilitarian thinking is important, for morality requires that we are concerned with increasing people's happiness and decreasing people's suffering. That is a good thing from the standpoint of any moral system, including that of the Sharia. Deontological thinking is also important, though. For morality, any valid system of morality requires that we judge certain actions good or bad, regardless of the consequences. So we should judge particular actions like, let's say, lying or incest as morally bad, regardless of the consequences. Finally, group conventional thinking is also important because one aspect of morality is a commitment to preserving one's group and its distinctive way of life. Were Muslims to lose their distinctive shared norms, they would cease to exist as a people and a community. And it is a good thing to preserve the Muslim community. At the same time, it should be noted that individual Islamic legal rules are complex. In many cases, they are shaped by multiple patterns of moral thinking simultaneously. Take the Islamic legal rule prohibiting murder. This rule has a utilitarian aspect. So yeah, how can we explain why we shouldn't murder? Part of it is hifth an-nafs. Part of it is preventing the type of suffering that is associated with the threat of being killed. However, the Islamic legal the rules for punishing murder also are distinctive. Muslims have a distinctive group norm for punishing murder that cannot be explained in it has a non-rational element to it. So for instance, the distinctive group norm of Muslims in practicing murder is qisas, which says, for instance, the victim's family may demand the execution of the murderer, or they may demand blood money, or they may forgive the murderer. That's not the only way of preventing murder. That's not the only way of punishing murder, but it is the way that Muslims as a community punish murder. Another example is inheritance law. So Islamic inheritance law has a deontological aspect in that it requires care for kin. All human beings can agree that care for kin is an important moral value. Yet the specific inheritance shares that are laid down reflect distinctive Muslim group norms. So for instance, if you start saying things like, well, if the deceased has children, then the parents each inherit 1/6 of the wealth. This is not something that can be explained entirely in rational terms. However, it is the way that Muslims take care of their kin through this particular system. It is their distinctive form of life. The fact that Islamic law incorporates these 3 types of moral thinking is important, I think, for a number of reasons. One of these reasons is it shapes how we understand Sharia doctrines from the past, but it's also relevant to current debates over Sharia and its application in the modern world. One of the characteristics of modernity since the mid-19th century in the Muslim world is the rise of Islamic reformist movements led by people like Syed Ahmed Khan or Muhammad Abdu or Rashid Rida. And one common characteristic of these movements is they emphasize the utilitarian thinking dimension of Islamic law. Sometimes it could even be argued that this becomes the dominant element of their thought. However, pre-modern Muslim jurists have an understanding of Islamic law which acknowledges that utilitarian thinking is important. But unlike many modern thinkers, they don't approach the view that basically Islamic law can almost be reduced to utilitarian thinking. Muslim jurists in the pre-modern period resist this. So yes, of course they consider maslaha, but they recognize correctly that Islamic law is not simply maslaha-based reasoning. It's not simply maqasid sharia-based reasoning. That's an important element, but there are other elements as well. So Islamic law cannot simply be, for instance, a bunch of maslaha, mursala, or istihsan. That's one element of the law, but it cannot be reduced to utilitarian thinking, because to reduce Islamic law to utilitarian thinking would be to ignore its deontological dimension. It would also be to ignore its group conventional dimension. For instance, if we reduced Sharia or overemphasized the utilitarian dimension of Islamic law, we would lose the deontological dimension. So for instance, as I noted earlier, it can be argued that deontological thinking tells us that it's always good to care for elderly parents. But oftentimes in the West, it's argued that people do not have an obligation to provide care for their elderly parents. Rather, the state should care for their elderly parents by providing Social Security or homes for them. And it's believed that overall happiness in society will increase if people no longer have an obligation to take care of their parents, because they'll be more free to do what they wanted to do with their lives. Now, were Muslims to reduce the Sharia to utilitarian thinking, they might justify such a view. They might justify such a view based on maslaha. They might say, well, the rules of the Sharia change from time to time and place to place. Yeah, in the past, people depended upon their extended kinship networks to take care of them in their old age. But right now, the best way to preserve happiness is to, for instance, have the state take care of people in their old age. Another example is this. A purely utilitarian approach to the Sharia might lead Muslims to overlook the group conventional component of Sharia thinking. Thus, people will often argue that Muslims should seek to integrate with broader global culture. They should give up their specifically Sharia-mandated dietary rules, dress rules, marital rules, criminal punishment rules, and so on. And it will be argued that if Muslims do this, if they integrate into the global culture in this fashion, they will be happier, they will be accepted, and moreover, they will no longer be bound by certain rules, certain restrictive rules from the past. Nevertheless, such a project of integration would result in the abolition of the Muslim community. For a community, any community, including the Muslim community, can only exist insofar as there are individuals who share distinctive group norms. So for that reason, recognizing that there are these different components of moral thinking embedded in the Sharia helps us, I would argue, have a better appreciation of the reasoning, the moral reasoning underlying the Sharia in the past. And it also is these are also helpful points to keep in mind when people are theorizing usul fiqh for the modern age, theorizing politics for the modern age, theorizing the future of the Sharia and Islamic civilization. They have a stronger textual study of the Sharia is wonderful, no doubt. Studying books is great, no doubt. But there's a huge amount of evidence, whether we're talking about psychological experiments, whether we're talking about cross-cultural surveys, whether we're talking about neuroimaging, whether we're talking about animal studies, that we can use to revolutionize our understanding of the Sharia and other elements of the Islamic tradition and apply it to research on the past, present, and future of Islamic civilization. I'm very excited to share those ideas with you and to get your feedback, because I know that this is a project that Istac is a leader in. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aria and Nakissa. Jazakumullah khair. It is a very, very nice discussion about the biological and psychological foundation of Islamic law. And you compared it with the three ethical theories, and you related how they come to agree and how we separate from them when it comes to Islam, the application of Islamic Sharia. We have a few questions here, and I will share them with you. I'll paraphrase first one. Which says that since morality and happiness is subjective, how do we reconcile Islamic creed of happiness, that means what Allah dictates, with relative happiness? Basically, is asking the question, like the advocates of LGBTQA values of morality or happiness in explaining or justifying the ideology.
Well, to say that human biology, has some bearing on what could be considered moral or immoral, this has historically been justified in a number of different ways, including in Islamic discourses. So one major idea that you have in Islamic thought is that of fitra, that God is not only the creator of particular laws, but God is the creator of human nature. And ideally, the Sharia should fit to some extent with human nature. That doesn't mean that the Sharia isn't distinctive, that it doesn't have distinct culturally specific features. No, of course it does. That is an element of kind of the group conventional moral thinking. But it could be argued that certain of these principles are, if someone wants to say that they're rooted in the human mind, that would be correct. But there are certain things that are rooted in the minds of all human beings and open up the door to a type of intersubjectivity, a type of shared moral norms. And if one believes that God has created human beings and the biological foundations of their morality, it could be argued that certain of, or at least it has been common to argue in human history and in the Islamic tradition, that these particular moral inclinations that we have are to some extent authorized, or where God created us with them because he intended us to take them into account. But I mean, I'm not much of a theologian, but that would be one way of looking at these particular norms, or linking this discussion about Islamic norms to historical Muslim discussions on theology, especially the notion of fitra.
Okay, let me go to another question, which is, just a minute, I need to go to the chat box here. The question is like this, and it's going to be paraphrasing, that regarding biological paradigm of ethics and of defending one's group, What is your take on ethical paradigm that is rooted in Darwinism?
So sometimes when people will say an ethical paradigm rooted in Darwinism, it can mean different things. So sometimes what they mean is something which is social Darwinism, which would mean that every group is locked in combat with other groups, and then kind of the strongest group can win, and in fact, the strongest group should win. I think that the notion that the only aspect of human morality is promoting the protection and the interests of one's group actually conflicts with some of the moral norms that we've talked about. So for instance, I'm not denying that one aspect of human morality consists in trying to protect one's group and preserving one's group, and recognizing that human life always involves some degree of conflict, but also potentially cooperation with other groups. And that's why every country, for instance, needs a military, even if they want to have peaceful relations with others. However, there are certain aspects of human morality that don't involve promoting the interests of one's group. An example would be this: being honest. An example would be being honest. An example would be engaging in reciprocal relations of mutual help, either between individuals or between communities. If this community helps me, I'm going to go ahead and help them. An example would be building a society based on purity, kind of avoiding building a society with kind of good akhlaq, with a world that is based on that is where purity kind of plays a role. Those are elements of human morality that are not based in group struggle. So I would say this: to the extent that Darwinian concepts of morality imply that human moral life is simply about the struggle between different groups, I would say that view actually isn't supported by recent cognitive science research. Recent cognitive science research would say that's one element of human interaction, but human morality goes so far beyond that. So there are so many elements of human morality that go beyond simple conflict between groups, although there is that conflict between groups as well. I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Thank you. Now I call upon Brother Khalid Chino. He wants to ask a question directly to you. So Brother Khalid, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Not the right moment to express my delight on hearing your talk, but very pointedly, I'd like to know this discussion of yours on features which are very common across the board, geographical or cultural or religious, with respect to human nature. This has been spoken of certainly by many different scholars, but I guess the subject of my research is Shah Waliullah, and part of it is his notion of irtifaqat. Would you be able to say something on that would add to my knowledge on the subject?
Forgive me, but I am not an expert on Shah Waliullah, and I would be scared to speak out of ignorance. But so you said his concept of ittifaqat, so kind of things that are agreed between different human groups?
Yes, and Ibn Ashur also has subsequently, but a century or so later, written on that.
So I would say this: one thing that this data can help us do is, so all human beings, or it's very common for people to notice that there is in fact common ground between different human communities. Muslims in the pre-modern period had some understanding of what that common ground was. Proponents of international human rights norms, Western understandings of international human rights norms, have some understanding of what that common ground is. What is exciting to me about cognitive science is it provides us with some empirical way of adjudicating certain debates over these issues. So for instance, if I were writing on a particular thinker, like, for instance, imagine that I was writing on I wanted to come up with some new research about Shah Waliullah. I might say Shah Waliullah had this notion that there were certain features of human behavior or human morality that were shared among all human communities. And in fact, 3 of the principles that he said are shared among all human communities have a lot of scientific backing. And in fact, we can say that he was kind of noticing these 3 principles. So maybe Shah Waliullah says, all people agree on care for kin. All people agree that incest is wrong. You could go ahead and say, this is a new biologically informed reading of Shah Waliullah that no one has ever done before. However, there were other things that Shah Waliullah believed were common between human communities, but in fact seemed to have been a particular element of culture, maybe in the Indian subcontinent. So that would be a new way of reading someone like Shah Waliullah. I hope that helps a little bit.
I mean, what exactly has cognitive research done or proved with respect to features which are common in human nature? I mean, I'm sure that is your field, and I'm excited to be able to know more.
I mean, I would say that probably, I mean, the best explanation that I can at least give right now is just in my published research, which I would say check out also additionally, because if you check out that research, there's actually citations, which is useful. But I would say that cognitive science has provided significant evidence for at least 5 to 15 separate distinctive moral principles related to property rights, related to disgust, related to reciprocity, related to group loyalty, related to, for instance, if someone harms another person, they should receive a similar harm, like a qisas type, eye for an eye, a type rule. And interestingly enough, cognitive science has also provided a lot of evidence that not only are these certain common moral principles, but there are these certain common theological principles that humans share. So one is belief in a life after death. One is belief that if you do something bad will happen to you. If you do something good will happen to you. Another is the belief in spirit beings. And then another interesting one is there's a lot of evidence which indicates that in some form, human beings have this tendency to believe that the world is an artifact-like creation of a creator God. So that's obviously very closely related to contemporary Muslim or historical Muslim understandings of aql and fitra and how they might relate to the cosmological argument or the teleological argument. So those would be some examples, but the best way, I guess the best suggestion I could give you at this point would be to check out some of my articles and then look in the footnotes, because I will actually cite to many recent works that provide evidence for this in a lot more depth. So I hope that you find those suggestions somewhat useful.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. There is time to ask this last question from my side, at least. Okay. Wasn't it fitra that made you accept Islam at a very young age?
I would say, yeah, that is one good explanation, I think.
Okay, I will share the articles by Brother Dr. Aria Nakissa on the WhatsApp group of Istac. So I will share them, that everybody can access them and look at more deeply about his research. Dr. Aria, there's a question here again by Akeem. The instance you gave regarding the biological paradigm of ethics, I think it's repeated, sorry. No, it is a repeated question. All right, does anybody has any other question? So they can, we'll unmute you, and you are welcome to ask. So let us know if anybody has any other question or comment to make. It seems everybody is quiet. Okay, let me ask you this question. I have this question. Since I got involved with this challenging of cognitive science, and that's how you and I got connected. How do you see the role of cognitive science, apart from Sharia and the issue here? How do you see its role in teaching comparative religion to Muslim students, say in the International Islamic University or Istac?
Well, what I would,
wait. And how would you distinguish it from the former psychological theories of cognition?
So how would I distinguish it from past psychological theories?
Yeah.
Or okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, the major thing that I think distinguishes cognitive science of religion from some past psychological work, whether you're talking about Freud or Jung, or even psychological theories that are more recent that depend on experiments. So a lot of psychological theories are not based on strong experimental backing. Even when you do have other psychological theories which do involve experimentation, oftentimes this experimentation is only on adults, or it only involves children. This provides the research basis for your theories. But cognitive science of religion is different because it doesn't just involve experiments. It's an integrative paradigm. So it will also take account of things like cross-cultural anthropological surveys, so that additional source of evidence. Another thing is that cognitive science of religion is very much interested in biology and neuroscience. So for instance, it's unlike conventional psychological work, which just does experiments on humans. People who are interested in cognitive science of religion will look at animal studies, pay attention to animal behavior. They will also, and just due to new technologies, they will pay a lot of attention to neuroimaging, like fMRI and these other kind of scans for the kind of insights it can provide on how certain patterns of brain activity are tied to religious beliefs, certain religious beliefs, or certain types of moral thinking. Now, how could that be applied to Islamic studies? I think that Islamic studies in the past, in the West, has primarily been guided by humanistic paradigms, which involve dealing with texts and also qualitative forms of research that might involve beyond texts. They might involve like ethnography, ethnographic field work, and those are very important things. They're wonderful contributions that have been made to Islamic studies through the study of texts and through the study of field work. But it can be a challenge, given how many great scholars have done this before us, to go ahead and come up with new insights. But many people believe that a revolution is going to occur in the global humanities over the next 2 decades or so. And that revolution is going to come partly from cognitive science, integrating all these new types of data into so not to get rid of humanities scholarship, but to integrate humanities scholarship with evidence from neuroscience and biology and psychology and so forth. Another element of this transformation is going to be related to data science. So data science is important for a number of reasons, whether we're dealing with Muslim societies or global societies generally, or whether we're dealing with texts, because now we might have certain ideas about the impact of Islamic norms or Islamic law on Muslim societies. We might say, well, due to the impact of Islamic norms, maybe Muslims care more about kin than other non-Muslim societies, or maybe Muslim societies have a higher level of religious belief. Now you can actually collect global statistical data on these kind of things, you can do this through kind of a sociological or economic statistics, but you can also do it by examining texts, examining textual traditions across the world. So for instance, you could go ahead and see, let's say we imagine all of the texts that come out of Malaysia. How often is God mentioned in these texts? How often is, let's say, for instance, family mentioned in these texts compared to China, compared to the United States? And do we see patterns that change over time? That gives us insight into the changing psychology of these Muslim societies and how they are reacting to modernity. So I would say Islamic studies is going to be a very exciting place in the future, because we will be able to hopefully combine this great treasury of humanistic resources with these other new methods and forms of data.
Yeah, we have here with us Dr. Farooq Musa, who's a medical doctor, and well, thank you, Dr. Farooq, to be here. He says he's very much interested in the ontological aspects for many years, and is interested in the practical application of what you have researched. Could you speak on the actual real-world application of your work in personal, interpersonal, social, community, and global current hot issues? Yes, yes, I have another question for you later. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that it is possible, given the type of data that we have today, to show that certain psychological transformations are tied to certain statistically measurable social transformations. For instance, there are certain transformations in a society. I'll give you an example. When families grow smaller in size, it appears that people have less care for kin, and also they are less concerned with preserving their traditions. And the way that you can do this is you go ahead and you can look at sociological data in terms of fertility and family size for different countries in the world. And then you can go ahead and give them questionnaires, like in World Value Survey. Rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think that it's important to take care of your family, or to take care of your parents? Or how important do you think it is to be married? Or on top of that, how interested are you in preserving your cultural tradition? How proud are you of your heritage? How nationalistic you are? How nationalistic are you? And there's a relationship between family size and these types of, and the morality that people have. There's also apparently a link between Western schooling, number of years of Western style schooling, which is geared towards a very specific type of analytic thinking, and irreligiosity. So for instance, one of the features of Western thinking is encouraging doubt, encouraging criticism, encouraging questioning. This is not part of pre-modern systems of education, or rather, it's a less important component of pre-modern systems of education. Pre-modern systems of education, like madrasa education in an Islamic context, doubt and criticism have a role, but a lot of what is taught there consists of affirming teachings that are rooted in human biology, or rooted in the fitra, various moral inclinations that people have about taking care of kin, or avoiding disgusting things, or being honest. It's not about trying to undermine those two. It's not to encourage people to doubt. Well, why do you believe that it's wrong to do something disgusting? Why do you believe in God? Why do you believe in an afterlife? That's a specific element of Western education, which appears to psychologically transform populations. So if you have an educational system that's modeled on Western education, you increase the years of schooling, that is probably going to psychologically impact the society by reducing their religious intuitions in terms of their intuitive inclination to, let's say, believe in an afterlife or believe in God. So these are things to take into account when people are thinking about how many years of Western schooling would it be good for Muslim populations to have? What is the ideal family size? People need to recognize that those types of decisions can transform the psychology of the population, and that traditional Muslim civilization is associated with a particular psychology, which is unique. It's different from the psychology that you find in the West. It's also quantitatively different from the psychological patterns that you find in Latin America, in China. Indeed, when people will do studies, they will say Muslim population, this is the article in Religion Compass, I present some of this evidence, but Muslim societies are the most religious societies on earth. They're the most family-oriented societies on earth, to the extent that they alter their social structures, their educational systems, their laws, their forms of entertainment and social interaction in keeping with patterns that emerge from the West, they will psychologically transform the population, and Muslims will internalize a psychology similar to that, more similar to that found in places like the United States, which comes with certain benefits, but which also comes with a number of costs. And people should be conscious of that, I think, or it's useful to be conscious of that.
Okay, I'm continuing with a question by Dr. Farooq Musa. Do we have any material for lay people to discuss this insights of yours outside the academic circle?
I mean, I would say once again, so I can go ahead and send to various people, or just I permit Professor Imtiaz, if he feels like he has time, if he wants to post some of my articles to some kind of server. But I've actually done, so one article that deals a lot with this is the Religion Compass article that Professor Imtiaz mentioned that just came out. I also have an article that came out of the Journal of World History called Cognitive Science, Islam, Cognitive Science and the Study of Colonialism. So it's basically how colonialism should not just be seen as imposing certain cultural or political or legal institutions, but one of the major consequences of colonialism was to promote the psychological transformation of Muslim societies. And I try and explain how traditional Muslim institutions, madrasas, mosques, family structures, Sufi tariqas, imparted a particular psychology, and that Western colonialism inculcates a very different type of psychology with drastic social consequences. So it's kind of a way of looking, because I would argue that modernity, whether we're talking about the colonial phase or the post-colonial World War II phase, is about a world in which certain political organizations and countries are trying to transform the world in their image, maybe westernize the world. And part of that involves changing people's fundamental epistemology, changing people's fundamental morality, changing people's fundamental religiosity. And I would say that I think a lot of people would agree with that, but they wouldn't conceptualize this in terms of biologically rooted psychology. And they also wouldn't bring to bear the types of quantitative data that I think are relevant and compelling and important to analyzing these things, both among scholars like yourselves or among the general public.
Yeah, I had that article on colonialism, which you mentioned, and cognitive science. I will share that one too. There's a large question here from Sri Lalu Gade, I think it's from Pharma, from Indonesia. The question is like this: when a friend wants to discuss issue of morality and society, they would first formulate limits of that morality, which can be accepted by all teachings, religions, and ideologies. And they will describe the universals. But detailed taxonomy of every cosmology, of every human action. Without it, the discussion of morality will be very subjective, according to each individual's personal experience. I don't see anything enlightening about the story about morals if we only talk from one or two aspects, or just use a mere cognitive aspect. Morality seems to have never been touched by human mind, science, even though it can be done in every day.
I mean, I wouldn't reduce the study of morality to cognitive science. So I would agree with you. And I would also agree that it's important to take into account for scientific purposes or just, purposes of being a human being. It's instructive to know what everyone else has been thinking and all the different perspectives that exist out there. So I would never say that cognitive science research is the only way of approaching this, or is sufficient alone as a means of addressing this complex question of how we deal with morality. I do think that it is a helpful resource, and it's also a helpful resource because it allows us to make statements which aren't subjective or which are somewhat less subjective about shared patterns of moral thinking between human beings, because a lot of people define, when they're talking about common ground or common principles or common patterns of thought or emotion or common patterns of relationships between human beings, they will make statements that certain things are common, whereas in reality, they're not very common.
Okay.
So cognitive science allows us to approach this in a little bit more of an objective manner.
Yeah, this takes me again to, I have a question again here, that when we teach Islamic studies, it is so restricted kind of a field that we need to include, say, studies about theories and approaches to the world religions, or theories and approaches to what you are doing, like method and theory, which is basically neglected in the area of Islamic studies. How would you shape a curriculum or introduce, going beyond? Like there was an attempt, like American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, and now we need to go beyond that. So how would you recommend comment on that one?
Oh, well, I mean, I think one thing to do would be so one project, so this would be related to how I would address this issue. So one of the things that I have to do at my university presently is I teach a lot of Islamic studies courses, but I teach some courses that are more comparative in character. So right now I teach a course called Religion in South and Southeast Asia, which actually, it has Christianity and Islam as important components, but it primarily has Hinduism and Buddhism, as more attention is actually given to them and their place in South and Southeast Asian history. And actually next semester, I'm teaching a class called Comparative Religion, where I will look at the Chinese traditions like Taoism and Confucianism and Chinese Mahayana Buddhism. And also, in addition to that, I will look at the types of religiosity that recur in hunter-gatherer societies. So one way that I try and handle this is I say, okay, religious traditions usually have at least 3 aspects to them. I kind of use this as a first step. I say religious traditions usually have certain theological claims that are often shaped by biologically rooted intuitions. They often have moral claims that are shaped by biologically rooted intuitions. And third, they often have aesthetic claims that are based on biologically rooted intuition. So human beings have certain intuitions, not only about what is true, about what is morally good, but also about what is beautiful. So for instance, a healthy face is more beautiful than a face that looks sickly. A environment which has a lot of water and lush greenery is more beautiful than an environment which is arid. I mean, this is if I ever give this lesson or this lecture on the psychological and biological foundations of Islamic aesthetics and architecture, I'll be talking about it then. So I take those, the intuitions regarding truth, intuitions regarding morality, intuitions regarding aesthetics. And then I use that as a common framework to analyze all of the different religions. And oftentimes I'll give specific attention to how is Islam similar to these different traditions, whether it's Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, and also what is distinctive about Islam, what is different about Islam, and how do the different elements that are found in these different religious traditions shape their societies over time and also shape these societies today. Because one of the things that people have found in quantitative studies, when they're looking at socioeconomic data from societies across the world, the religious legacy that's found in a particular country, even a secularized country, its religious legacy in terms of Protestantism, Catholicism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism affects their psychology to this day. And it affects, for instance, their rate of birth or their fertility rate, their family size, the extent, the intensity of their religious belief, their level of nationalism, even their level of, so it has all of these different impacts on their society. So that's another thing that I would take into account. So after linking all of these different religious traditions and comparing them in terms of their underlying psychological and biological foundations, then I would say quantitatively, how have they impacted different societies? So what is the impact of having a Buddhist as opposed to a Muslim or a Christian heritage? How does that affect society today? Not only in the sense of generalization, but in the sense of, like, let's say GDP growth in the sense of homicide rates, in the sense of family size. These are comparisons that we're now in a position to make. And I think those comparisons will very much enrich the future of comparative religion and efforts, particularly to compare the Islamic tradition to other traditions.
Okay. There's a question which Sister Myra is going to ask. So Sister Myra, please go ahead.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Professor, I'm trained in the traditional Islamic sciences, in particular Islamic jurisprudence or ifta, and I'm wondering how the approaches that you've highlighted would be relevant for Muslim jurists in the formulation of Sharia-based law.
Well, okay, so that's a wonderful question. It's a very important question. So one of the things that I've tried to indicate is when we recognize, so if we recognize that the Sharia has these different forms of morality, and we can link different concepts in the Sharia to these different forms of morality, like maybe we can link maslaha to the utilitarian type thinking, and we can link other rules with respect to purity to deontological thinking. And then we can see that there are these various rules that are about preserving distinctive, that there are various rules which prescribe that Muslims wear different types of dress or engage in unique rituals, and this is related to group conventional thinking. One of the things that really impacts how a legal system is applied is how much we are emphasizing each of these different types of moral thought. So if one were to emphasize utilitarian, so I would say one of the features, as I indicated earlier, that characterizes modern ifta, modern efforts at ijtihad, is kind of boosting the utilitarian component of Islamic thought. And to some extent, many thinkers will boost it to the point that the deontological component or the community, the group conventional component will be marginalized. So certain people will say, yeah, you know, why should we even care about wearing distinctive Muslim dress? Or why should we even care about halal meat? Maybe, or why should we care about having a legal system in our country that reflects distinctive Islamic norms? There are other sets of norms, maybe human rights norms, that are better at producing human happiness than these type of norms were in the past. And many people argue on that basis for replacing all Islamic norms, maybe even all Islamic norms outside the realm of ibadat, with norms drawn from the West based on considerations of maslaha. And I would argue that if we can appreciate, and people will give fatwas to that effect, that this is somehow legitimate, but I would say that any effort to replace any element of Islamic law with other legal systems, of course, it's legitimate to take into account maslaha-based arguments, but attention should also be given to these deontological components of the law and also to these group conventional components of the law, and recognize that actually one of the things that distinguishes Muslim communities as well quantitatively, when in terms of quantitative psychological studies, is Muslims have the strongest form of religious identity of all the groups in the world. So other groups will have stronger forms of cultural identity or racial identity, but for Muslims, they have if you ask them, like, rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is being a Muslim to you, they'll give 9, whereas maybe a Christian will give a 5 or a Buddhist will give a 4, but they'll say but at the same time, they might say their national identity or their racial identity is very highly ranked. So it is important, I think, for instance, if one were to, let's say, give a fatwa that all Muslims should abolish Islamic laws concerning, let's say, commercial transactions or criminal law on the basis of maslaha. In making those kind of arguments, one should recognize that this could dissolve the Muslim community. So it could destroy the shared norms, and it could be problematic from the standpoint of group conventional morality. And if one resists that, if one says, no, it is important that we always follow these norms, then rather than just simply abolishing various types of Islamic law, you could say, no, we need to preserve these norms in the sense of creating an Islamic banking sector so we can keep the commercial norms, creating halal tourism so we can go ahead and have forms of entertainment that are consistent with Islamic norms. In terms of making everything halal, from, let's say, cosmetics to food, to keep Islamic dietary laws, because if Islamic dietary laws go, the Muslim community will no longer have norms that unite them, and the community will dissolve, like many communities have dissolved.
Yeah. Aria, I have a question. Thank you.
I hope that helps to some extent.
Yes, thank you. Your whole presentation was very enlightening. Thank you so much. Look forward to reading your articles, inshallah.
It's an honor. It's an honor. I'm happy to contribute and to stay in touch with anyone who's interested in doing so.
Aria, a question I have again to cognitive science and evolutionary anthropologists or a journalist like you remember, Robert Wright. He wrote a book, God made or something, God invented. What I'm trying to, I'm saying like this, that cognitive science and Buddhist studies have gone hand in hand in proving, or Buddhist scholars of Buddhist studies have tried to prove that the truth of Buddhism through cognitive science. Robert Wright came up with a book later on. First, he criticized religion, and then later on, he's the journalist with the New York Times. He came up with a book that Buddhism is the true religion. Buddhism and cognitive science are going hand in hand, while Islamic studies is kind of, we still have not entered into this field in spite of Islamization of knowledge and all that. So again, the question, there's a gap, and maybe I'm repeating myself, and that gap of keeping a pace with the current researches going on in different fields of knowledge is a challenge for Islamic studies.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not just the case in Malaysia. It is the case in the American Academy as well. So one of the reasons why I am kind of a little bit unique, one of the reasons why maybe didn't find a lot of scholars doing this kind of work, even in the West, is because generally speaking, scholars of Islamic studies are not particularly interested, even in the West. It is a very Islamic studies in the West, which is probably impacted a little bit Islamic studies in other countries as well, is a little bit averse to interdisciplinarity. They are maybe not so concerned with integrating different types of knowledge. I think in many ways, Iohk or Istac is probably more interested in blending together or coming up with interdisciplinary paradigms or integrating different types of knowledge than many scholars in Islamic studies are in the West. But I do think I'm sure that people in Western countries, people in non-Western countries will resist some of these changes for a while. But the danger in doing that is people are going to become less and less interested in the type of scholarship that is produced. So if you go on YouTube, if you go on Twitter, if you look at the kind of ideas that are circulating, what people are talking about, they're very excited about new perspectives on the world that are informed by quantitative data that take into account the latest findings from neuroscience and biology and psychology. And there will be two different types of scholars, two different types of institutions, two different types of research centers. One research center will embrace these potentialities for change and new research and will reach out and try and circulate it through social media and the internet and use it to contribute to popular discourse in a way that revitalizes perhaps Islamic civilization or other civilizational projects. And then there are going to be people who just say, no, I'm not interested. And all things being equal, they're going to have a little bit more of a challenge in terms of speaking in a way that people consider to be relevant to developing modern discourses on humanities topics and political and social debates about the future.
Thank you. Okay, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we will unmute you if you have any question to ask for him, to ask Dr. Aria. I don't see anybody. So Aria, thank you very much for a very enlightening speech, talk and lecture, and raising all these
Professor?
issues. Yeah, yes.
Sorry, just one question. I actually wrote it in the chat box, but I don't want to be too ubiquitous. Your arguments based on cognitive science actually appear to be strengthening those who base their arguments on maqasid Sharia, or rather who promote maqasid of Sharia. Am I right in inferring that?
It's a complex issue because I say in one sense, absolutely yes. I would say that cognitive science provides very, very compelling evidence. Some of the most compelling evidence that utilitarian thinking of the type which is embodied in maqasid Sharia is fundamental to Islamic thinking and has always been. And the reason why it's always been an important part of how Muslim thinkers have thought about the Sharia is because Muslim thinkers, Muslim scholars are human beings and they think like human beings. I would, on the other hand, say one challenge that you get from some proponents of maqasid Sharia in the modern era is they don't recognize, in some cases, the full complexity of human morality. So one can say that maqasid Sharia and utilitarian thinking is a fundamental, very, very important dimension of human moral thought, but also caution against ignoring these other dimensions. Because otherwise you would have a morality that is purely based or disproportionately based on utilitarian thinking. And that would be a type of morality which is not very similar to pre-modern Islamic morality. There would be an enormous rupture with the pre-modern Islamic tradition, but it would be an unconscious rupture. And if we were to have that type of rupture, we would have to face a challenge because people would say subtly, in a very subtle and unconscious way, you have fundamentally changed the morality, the moral spirit, the structure, the norms of the Sharia, even if you don't recognize that you're doing so. And that's a big challenge today because one of the features of Western psychology, actually, so when people will do quantitative moral studies of different psychological tendencies, in Western societies, utilitarian thinking is very, very strong. Actually, one of the unique features of Western psychology compared to the psychology that you find in other countries is an especially strong emphasis on utilitarian thinking as opposed to other types of thinking.
Yeah, Aria, thank you very much. Actually, your very enriching talk this evening and lecture, very, very comprehensive. It basically fits into the series which we have here at Istac, which is named by Dr. Abdulaziz Barghouth, our dean, as Futures of Integration of Human Knowledge. And he is the person who always talks about multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary to become the part of the Istac curriculum or the pedagogy and research. So now I call upon Professor Abdulaziz Barghouth to say a few words and please make comments, and please, Professor Abdulaziz.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Dr. Aria, thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation and presenting this excellent lecture on this very important topic. First, let me thank Prof. Imtiaz for his beautiful and relevant selection of the topic and the speaker. And I think you have raised a lot of good questions and paved the way, not only for Istac, but I think for Muslim scholars, those who specialize in Islamic studies and religious studies from an Islamic perspective, to look at this multi-dimensional perspective, look at this type of paradigm approach that you are taking, so that we can, even we go for ijtihad and renewal of Islamic thought and civilization, we base on very structured and systematic system thinking or paradigm thinking. That's what I like in the whole lecture, and also the way how you use this framework to deal with the various issues and topics that you you mentioned in your presentation. I think that's what we need really to do in Islamic studies. We start thinking system, we start thinking paradigm, we start thinking from structured, well-integrated frameworks where our understanding of Islam is well integrated, not segmented, not partialized, actually, for that matter. So I think you really made a good case, and inshallah, Prof. Imtiaz and other brothers and sisters in Istac also will engage you more, and we want you to have some sessions with our postgraduate student. I think some of the people who asked you are all PhD students in Istac. Maybe they love to see you in person, face to face.
I hope I can visit this summer. It would be wonderful to have any kind of engagement or interaction. I have so much respect for Istac-Iium. I have, of course, an alumnus of Istac-Iium, and also Istac is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. I mean, it's a wonderful place to visit. Yeah. I love architecture. I'm a big fan of Islamic architecture. So it's a real treat for someone like me to have the honor of visiting scholars such as you and these graduate students there.
Inshallah. I think that's great. And when you talk about the building and the architecture and all this, you remind us of the founder of this great institute, Professor Naqib al-Attas, and his thoughts and ideas. And one of the things that he always emphasizes the idea of worldview. Worldview, I think, worldview, especially from an Islamic perspective, is that key which puts things together for us to see the Sharia in that bigger picture, to see maqasid in that bigger picture, to see ethics and morality in that bigger picture. And in the end, we understand the real meaning of a human and a human being in Islam. And from here, we can develop all types of knowledge once we understand what does a human being mean in the Quran and in Islam. And I think you have made a very great contribution tonight. And we would like to really thank you. And we hope to see you and listen to you in other occasions and topics, inshallah. And hope to see you soon. And in the end, I would like to thank all the participants. In fact, the people who are here and also in the YouTube are all very intellectual minds and very interested in the type of integrated thoughts that you are putting together. And hopefully, inshallah, we can disseminate this type of thinking. And I think one of the brothers in the question said, this is great. How do we take it now down to other levels of the society and community so that this very integrated thinking can have impact in society, inshallah. I think that's what I would like to say, Prof. Yes, thank you for the great effort. Thank you to all the participants tonight. May God bless you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdul Aziz. It is our destiny that we came into contact with Dr. Aria, and he brings this fresh air with us. So with the words from Professor Abdul Aziz Bergut, we end this session, and inshallah we see you again in the next series, next lecture in this series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Aria. That was very nice.
Okay, I will go ahead and leave, and then maybe
Yeah,
I'll give you a call in a couple of minutes. And okay.
Sure. Okay. Right. We'll talk. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Oh, Mas Alif. Aduh, Mbak Boyo, dan teman-temannya, sekalian beres-beres juga